Excellent. So
Oh,
hello everyone. Uh, let's wait just perhaps one more minute until everyone is on board. We have already 26 people in the room, but we're usually 40 something. So let's just get one more minute. In the meantime, and before I introduce our expert for today, let me just recap briefly what we have been doing, where we are, and what's next. So, as you may recall, we started with with the live session that looked at the nexus between finance and nature, and tried to populate that nexus with the concepts that are more frequently used: ecosystem services disruption, dependencies, impacts, the types of financial risks, and so on. Then we moved into the issue of actual regulation of the nexus, and we looked particularly at the issue of disclosures in the context of Europe, but also elsewhere. Then we moved last week to the issue of data, the different databases and data providers that are available beyond just the ESG market, and that look also at impacts. And today, we're going to look at the instruments and the different ways in which the two issues, finance and nature, can be synergized, and particularly the way in which, I mean, the structuring of different transactions and products that may lead to channeling finance into nature conservation. So that's the current approach. And as usual, we're going to start with an expert presentation. I will introduce Craig Tribolet just in one moment. But after Craig's presentation, we will try to take, as usual, perhaps two, depending on time, of course, but perhaps two rounds of three questions. So if you already have questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat, and I will be writing down your names in the order. And then when the presentation is over, we can start with the questions from that order, if that's agreeable. Right, then let me now turn to our expert for today, Craig Robin Tribolet. He is Director of Sustainability and External Affairs at April Group, a member of the RGE group of companies. April Group is one of the world's largest producers of pulp, paper, and board products. And in his role, Craig oversees the delivery of April sustainability commitments across the company's operations in Riau province, Sumatra, Indonesia, and leads the implementation of April's April 2030 transformation strategy. He also directs the company's landscape conservation strategy, including community conservation agreements designed to protect and restore natural forests adjacent to plantation concessions, and spearheaded the creation of April's Fire-Free Village program, a community-based fire prevention initiative that has significantly reduced forest fires. Craig is a forest ecologist by training. He has more than 20 years experience as an operational forester, landscape ecologist, and forest firefighter in Australia and Indonesia. He holds a master's degree in business management and is a published author on forest ecology, fire management, and wildlife survey techniques. Craig, thank you very, very much again for being with us. The floor is yours.
thank you, Jorge, and good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay and the connection's stable. We've had a few troubles with our connection today, so forgive me if it does get a bit jittery. And if I need to go back across anything, please just let me know, and I can pick that up. Now, I understand that Rose, you have the presentation on your side to help me out with my unstable connection. You guys are going to run that for me, and I'll just simply say next for the next slide. Let me start with a quick question while Rose just gets that into the presentation mode. And that's to say, why should companies care? Why should companies care about nature and nature finance? You know, with everything else that's going on in this busy, chaotic, complicated world, what is it that would make nature and nature financing a compelling business case for the board, for the shareholder, for management? And the reason I ask that question is because I want to come back to it when I finish our presentation together and re-ask that question. But I also propose it because it's the question that we get asked as a sustainability team, if not daily, certainly quite regularly. And we get asked that question by internal stakeholders, by external stakeholders, by finance companies, by governments and regulators. And so there's a very important discussion around why companies should be involved in nature and finance. And in fact, how do you make the case for companies in this complicated world to be involved in nature and finance? So for our discussion this evening, I thought I'd sort of break it into three parts. One is just sort of provide a bit of a perspective on some of the more theoretical aspects of nature finance and how companies are sort of engaging in that conversation. And I should say I'm not representing the entire private sector here. I'm just representing April. And so if my perspective is mainly not agreeing with yours from a private sector, I'd be fascinated to hear how you as a private sector are engaging with this conversation yourselves. Then I want to talk quickly about the company's position. Jorge mentioned some of our policies, our targets, and I just want to frame that. And then I really want to spend some time on exactly how we've built a nature financing mechanism and some of the projects we're doing, which I think is more interesting than anything else I could talk to in this whole presentation. Of course, I'm biased. As Jorge said, I'm a forest ecologist, so I'm always going to talk about the practical and outcome elements rather than the theoretical and policy pieces. Let me start with this picture that I've got on my screen here, and I really wanted to start with this photo. I got the team to dig it up for me today. Excuse the photo quality. It was taken with my jittery hands outside the helicopter window as we were flying across this, what is probably one of the largest peatland swamp forests in Indonesia, if not the region, the tropical peat swamp forest in the region. And it's so flat, you can almost see the curvature of the earth from this photo. And it's flat because it's a massive peatland. What we're seeing here is a tropical forest that is based on a gigantic sponge. And underneath this understory, it's wet for about 90% of the year, and it's flooded for about half of that, like solidly flooded for half that time. You couldn't walk through it. In fact, local communities use boats to access this forest. So it's a fascinating piece of forest. As I said, it's the last remnant of peatland swamp forest, largest remnant left. It's 150,000 hectares. And if you ever get a chance to visit us in Sumatra, the helicopter trip is one of the great moments when you're horizon to horizon is a conservation forest. And the reason I show that photo is because we manage it. As a private company, it's an investment we've made in nature. And I want to talk more about how we got to that position, how we came to be managing 150,000 hectares of conservation forest, and why that's a really valuable investment for the company. If I go to the next slide, please. So I asked the question of you, why should companies care? And fundamentally, it's because nature matters. We hear all these different, rules, how much companies depend on nature from moderately to highly dependent. For me, that's a bit of blah, 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 because honestly, we all depend on some degree to nature. I mean, if nature stopped tomorrow, the world stops tomorrow. There is no other compelling case for companies to be interested in nature except for the fact we entirely depend on it. How do you cost that when for decades nature's been treated as an externality? The tragedy of the commons, of course, is the key economic driver. The theory that people would have discussed around this when I was at university eons ago. But even at that stage, there was no way of understanding or compensating or providing any guidance for businesses to cost nature into their models. And even today, it's an ongoing discussion how do companies effectively, fairly, consistently do that. And that's why courses like the ones you're doing are so important. At least the discussions are happening today. And it's because nature is increasingly understood as really as an economic asset, but more importantly, it's now increasingly viewed as a financial risk. And we'll talk a little bit about how companies are starting to see that and how they're starting to account for that in their businesses. By far the biggest driver, of course, for companies is the risk, the discussion around risk. Companies are exceedingly sensitive to risk because it underpins everything they do. And so if we can build the case, internally, that, ignoring nature is a core risk, then it makes it much easier to build a business case to integrate nature and nature finance into your business models. There's a number of easy risks that companies are identifying around nature. Supply chains, for example. For us, we're a forestry company. We grow our own trees before we process them into various products from a plantation. And so we're exposed significantly to nature risk. But, for supply chains, flooding, fire, landslides, shipping is disrupted by storms at sea. So we see massive and increasingly regular supply chain disruptions related to changing climate and increasing intensity of storms. Regulatory changes, the EUDR, the European Union's deforestation-free regulation, is by far the biggest kid on the block when we're talking around regulatory changes. But even within Indonesia, there's a significant push for companies to take greater responsibility in the landscapes where they operate. How that's enforced is, of course, the next challenge beyond setting regulation, and it's going to be a similar challenge for the EUDR when that finally kicks in. But ultimately, companies are seeing very quickly that the regulatory ecosystem is changing around them, and if they don't engage in this discussion, they will be left behind. Of course, we've spoken about some of the physical risks for us. That includes fires and flooding, pests and diseases, and a range of other factors, including soil fertility changing over time, acidification, water quality changes. And these are real, they're measurable, we're seeing them change over time. And so when I noticed Jorge spoke around data, there is increasingly robust and reliable data sets which help drive this discussion around the physical risk to operations. And finally, I think, and clearly one of the most important ones for businesses, particularly businesses facing consumers directly and not necessarily B2B, business to business companies, but those B2C companies, is the reputational risks. No company wants to be implicated in destroying nature. And so how to shape a narrative that moves beyond simply greenwashing and more about ensuring that it's a core part of your business is increasingly part of the discussion that we're hearing. We all know how companies can respond. I'm sure this has been covered, from deterring companies, avoiding, minimizing, restoring. The dreaded term of offsets, of course, might creep in. But I think ultimately they are slowly being left behind as companies look to shift to, and we certainly are shifting towards, this discussion around nature positive. And nature positive means that you are making investments to have a positive impact on nature. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I think it's important that we have some definitions before we move too far down the path on this discussion. And so for April, when I'm talking about nature finance, I'm really talking about a range of financial mechanisms that we use to support the protection, restoration, and the sustainable management of the ecosystems where we operate, that might generate economic returns, but that certainly are critical in mitigating risks for the company. And for us, they operate across really three broad categories. And I'm sorry if this doesn't align with the definition that you guys might have been using, but this is how we have framed the discussion for our internal audience particularly. Of course, the first one is around the finance and how to manage your exposure to nature-related risks. And not only the exposure, but also the disclosures on risk and the impacts and dependencies that companies may have in their business models. TNFD, of course, released in 2020, was a really critical turning point for companies And why it was so critical, because it was the first time that we saw a shift from what was quite an academic discussion around nature finance and transferring that into how companies can practically implement some of those more academic concepts. Of course, it continues to evolve, it continues to adapt, and I think it's better for it. But things like TNFD were significant drivers of change. The Task Force for Nature for financial disclosures. So the second is transitional finance, and what I mean by this is how do you actually fund operational practices that might have impact. And I've got a lot more to say around how we've done this as a company later on. But for us, the big driver is the landscape restoration and landscape conservation work that we're doing. And the last one, of course, is I think the more nascent of the categories, and that's the nature markets, and maybe even the more uncertain of the three, because they're market mechanisms. They need to be able to respond to the supply and demand drivers of markets, and it effectively what you're asking people to do is to monetize ecosystem services. Now, it's probably arguably been done reasonably well for carbon, and that's because carbon's reasonably easy to measure. The reason I suspect that biodiversity credits haven't achieved quite the same market readiness that carbon credits have is biodiversity incredibly complex to measure. So why is it now starting to become more important? Why are companies now starting to engage in it? I mean, if we look back to where this might have all started, I think we've got to look back to maybe 2015 Paris Agreement. That really was the framing that allowed this discussion to even happen in the first place. Of course, the TNFD in 2020 was a fundamental piece in that, in bringing that forward, so companies could actually start to understand the language and unpack what the expectations of some of the stakeholders might be. But there's a third part to that puzzle, and that is the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was released in 2022 at COP15. And that became a really critical piece because for the first time, there were very tangible guidance set for and expectations set on companies. And the language that the Global Biodiversity Framework used was extremely accessible. 30 by 30, 50 by 50, halt and reverse nature loss by 2030, and living in harmony with nature and the nature positive by 2050. I mean, they are extremely accessible. It's extremely accessible language. It's easy to interpret. It's easy to understand, and companies were able to very quickly engage in what that meant. And so I think we need to really recognise that policy environment was quite an enabling environment for companies to move quickly and engage with nature finance. Of course, there's the ongoing realities that nature and climate are so closely linked, and all those climate drivers are directly impacting companies and their operations. So that's also a driver. What's also happened, and I think in line with the Paris Agreement, TNFD, and the Global Biodiversity Framework, is that investor and stakeholder expectations have risen incredibly quickly and have responded dramatically to the increase of information and disclosures that have become available to the marketplace. In some cases, they're being regulated through public companies and stock exchanges. Not always the case for private companies like us, but the benchmarks and the expectations of stakeholders have increased significantly. And even though, for example, the EUDR hasn't been implemented as a regulation, all of our European customers now fully expect that we show traceability back to source. Where we used to just show a map of our suppliers, they now expect a due diligence statement with every load showing where that product has come from and that it's literally deforestation free. We literally need to make that statement in a disclosures, in a due diligence statement. So the expectations of investors, stakeholders, customers have all risen significantly in the last few years. Now, we all know there's a significant gap. And I want to sort of have a chat around that when I get to how we're funding our nature investments. And the reason I want to get to that discussion is because companies do not always frame their investments as nature financing. And that's because the language is quite new. And we'll talk about that as we develop the discussion over the next sort of half an hour. Thank you. Next slide, please. So who are we? April is a large producer of pulp, paper, and board. We manage our own plantations under concessional licenses granted by the Indonesian government. We manage about just over 1 million hectares, 1.2 million hectares in Sumatra and Kalimantan in Indonesia. About half that area is plantations, 607,000 hectares of eucalyptus and acacia plantations. Incredibly fast growing plantations. They rotate on about a 4 to 5 year cycle. And we harvest that wood and bring it to a large mill in Riau province in Sumatra and process that into pulp, paper, board, and viscose, the sort of material you buy at Uniqlo for undergarments and exercise wear. So we have a broad range of products. We're diversified as a manufacturer. One of our biggest vulnerabilities to nature is, of course, what you can see in that photo in the background, and that's our plantation footprint. And in that photo, you can see a eucalyptus plantation. There's a road running through it on the right-hand side, and the light green is eucalyptus trees. They're probably about a year old. And the darker green is the conservation areas that thread through these plantations. And they either riparian buffers, patches, or blocks of conservation areas that thread their way through these forests. Incredibly biodiverse. We have Sumatran elephants. We have Sumatran tigers. Unfortunately, no more rhinos, Sumatran rhinos. We don't have any orangutans in our land base, but slightly further north, there's orangutans from where we are. We have sun bears, pangolins, a huge range of bird species, including a range of hornbills. A remarkable landscape to work in and to operate in and to take care of. And we take that obligation to operate in this landscape quite seriously. And we've made, as I'll explain, some very, very serious investments in conservation, recognizing that we're a landscape steward and that's our responsibility as a large company. So that's who we are. If we can go to the next slide, I'll talk about some of the commitments and some of our policy environments so we can understand a little bit more why we've made such big investments. I mentioned disclosures before. Disclosures are an incredibly important part of the overall sustainability work that we do. And it's been interesting the last few years watching that discussion shift from companies who are greenwashing and now into this concept of green hushing, and where we've navigated that space. And the way we've unpacked that is to be sure that all of our disclosures are data-driven and science-based. I'm a scientist myself, so I'm very committed to ensuring that when we do disclosure, that we have the data to support what we're saying. And we also ensure that the data is assured by third-party professionals to make sure that it's reliable and consistently good data. We report on our targets, which is the 2030 document you can see on the left. We report annually through our sustainability targets using the GRI standards. And we report on the collaborations that we have with a range of academic partners to ensure that we're employing the world's best practice and doing some of the world's best research. That photo you can see there in that challenge and collaboration shows a red and white tower. That's one of 4 greenhouse gas towers which we built within our plantation footprint as part of our commitment to gathering world's best data. There was no greenhouse gas emissions data gathering in the region, and so we built the first 4 towers to do that. I think there's 6 or 8 now in the region, and we own half of them. We publish that data. It's been recently published in Nature, and talks around the emissions that we're seeing from our plantations on peatland, our plantations on the eucalyptus soil, on the mineral soil, emissions from natural forest and emissions from unused land. So yeah, very much open to ensuring that we're doing high quality scientific collaborations with some of the world's best scientists and publishing that in peer reviewed journals to make sure that it's leading on to better discussions and ultimately better investments in nature based on solid data. Thank you. The next slide, please. I mentioned that we get our data assured. That's really important for anybody who wants to make disclosures. It's important because it's okay not to trust companies. I think that's okay. And not to trust everything a company says. I think that's okay. So the only way to trust is to ensure that the data is in a public space, that the data can be tested and reviewed and explored and critiqued, right? And so we're not afraid to put our data in the public space. We're not afraid to engage in discussions, and if we can do stuff better, we'll always accept those opportunities. And so part of that is working with people like KPMG, globally recognized audit and assurance group who do in-field assurance for about a month each year. Actually, they only finished last week this year's assurance process. And they work directly under the guidance of our independent stakeholder advisory committee. And the report that KPMG writes goes directly back to this independent stakeholder advisory committee and is used by that stakeholder advisory committee to guide them in their advice and guidance for April's management, and particularly on our sustainability commitments. I don't need to spend too much time on this, and if you want to see more on the work that they're doing, our sustainability report will come out in May. Last year's reports and previous year's reports are all available online, as is the independent assurance reports. We make sure that they are also published online. Thank you. Next slide. So where does that leave us in terms of how we manage our business, and particularly how we set targets for ourselves? And then how does that guide our investments in nature? Well, in 2019, we sat down as a team. There's about 700 of us who were engaged in this process on setting targets for where we wanted to be and what we wanted to look like by 2030. And what was really interesting, even as early as 2019, was it was very clear internally that there was a huge appetite to make significant investments in nature. Now, we didn't call it nature financing in 2019. Those words didn't exist, of course. But there was a huge appetite from the shareholder and from the management teams to make significant investments in nature. And we called it under the banner Thriving Landscapes, which you can see on the left-hand side there. It's one of the 4 pillars that we created for our April 2030 targets. There's 19 targets under those 4 pillars. The 4 pillars are climate positive, Thriving Landscapes, inclusive progress, which speaks to community engagement and the communities that live and work around our plantation footprint, and sustainable growth, which is largely around the work we're doing within our mill to ensure circularity and decreasing emissions and managing waste. But the focus I wanted to drill down in here quickly is on our Thriving Landscapes, which on the right hand side is the green box, and you can see there's 6 really important targets under that. Zero net loss of conservation area. Investing is a really important term in landscape conservation. Positive biodiversity gains. As an ecologist, I'm not really sure what that means, but we've been unpacking that for the past 5 years. Supporting wildlife protection, advancing tropical peatland science, and increasing our productivity from our plantation, so we don't need to expand our plantation. We can get more from the operational areas we already have. I think by far, for this discussion at least, is in 2019, it's clear that this company was already using terms like investment in conservation. So we're already, in terms of our maturity curve, fairly mature in terms of where we wanted to be. And I think we'll classify that now as in the nature finance discussions, even though we didn't have the language or necessarily the tools to define it as that at that stage. If we can go to the next slide, please. PEFC, I want to make a couple of quick comments around certification, and not to be controversial at all. Certifications has been historically a really important part of our overall forest management narrative. It's provided a certainty to the marketplace that we are meeting the commitments set by and the expectations set by global markets, and they're framed through global certification frameworks, PEFC, FSC. PEFC is the world's largest. It's about twice as big as the second group, FSC. It is a significant standard in the sense that it sets very strong guidance for how to manage how to manage large forest areas from a forest owner's perspective. I've got a really interesting, and we had a really interesting discussion around what's the future of things like certification. And the reason we're having this discussion is because there's a very real threat, existential threat to certification, and it's coming by the fact that the conversations around nature, particularly, are moving very quickly past how what certification can achieve, because we're now seeing nature become embedded as a financial mechanism, and that's not what certification is. Certification doesn't offer a financial outcome for companies. You don't get a better price for being certified. You may be able to access the market, but there's no premium for certified products. That's the truth. I'm not trying to dress it up, but there is literally no premium for having certified products. It is a market access tool. Now, as the regulation changes, particularly things like EUDR, as investor and stakeholder expectations change and increase, then certification just becomes a baseline of business as usual, and companies will very quickly realize that they are moving beyond the need for certification. And unfortunately, certification is not keeping up. And it's a very, very difficult situation for the world's big certification agencies. And, this is the challenge that we're having and discussing with them consistently. It's not to say they're irrelevant. Please don't quote me on that. It's not to say that. It's to say that their role is changing significantly. And how the market is viewing them is also changing significantly. If we can go to the next slide, please. So let's spend the next sort of 10 minutes having a look at exactly how we're investing in nature, given our promise that we're doing that. I think one of the most important pieces, and it took us a while to get there, is finally getting the language right. And we've been greatly helped by things like TNFD, to be honest, and the nature finance discussion that's exploded in the last 2 or 3 years, because it's really helped us have a language where we can navigate discussions with the whole of the business. We haven't always been able to do that, particularly our finance teams. It hasn't always been easy to justify the spend that we're making on nature. But the increasing sophistication around the language and how we can use that language as we talk to stakeholders has been a huge benefit for us in the sustainability game. And this document here is Thriving Nature. It is our path to nature positive. And what it does for the very first time as a company, it integrates all our nature and biodiversity protection commitments, and it talks to how we will action those and how we will pay for those, and then also what we want to be doing and how we want to be seen within those frameworks of the goals we've already set. It was released last year at the IUCN's World Conservation Congress. It was developed by April, but it was the result of inputs from over 30 experts from around the world, independent experts around the world, who read and reviewed this document. And I won't name names, that's not fair, but including people driving the nature positive agenda, if I could say it that way. So really leading experts who helped frame this document. It will be published online, and we will be able to share that in much more detail for everyone. If we go to the next slide, I really want to talk about what we're doing. So in 2014, before there was such a thing as nature finance, and Jorge spoke very quickly about this, we recognized that fires were a huge threat to our business. And they were a huge cost to our business. Landscape fires were actively burning across our boundaries and destroying our plantations. And unfortunately, burnt wood is completely unusable in the pulping cycle. We have to just heap it all up and we start again. And so if that happens towards the end of the rotation cycle in the 5th year, we've wasted 5 years. That wood just literally gets heaped up and rots on the ground. We can't use it. And so it was a huge cost to our business. And we recognized that a huge amount of money had been spent already on dealing with this fire issue. Unfortunately, all the investments in the previous sort of 20 years had been on firefighting and detection and response. And so we all sat down and we said, well, apparently spending $100 billion on fire detection, response, and firefighting hasn't solved the fire problem. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, because no one had actually thought through the root causes that were driving the decision making of why fires were starting in the first place. And let's be clear, Indonesia is not a fire-prone landscape. It has 2,500 mils of rainfall a year. It does not have natural fires. We explored over 80 separate fire incidences in detail, and not one of them had a natural cause. We've looked at the data since then. In the past 10 years, we haven't detected one single fire in the past 10 years that has had a natural cause. All the fires that we're dealing with here are lit by a human agent. And so in many ways, that's frustrating, but it also means that we can interrupt those cycles if we understand the reasoning and the root causes of why people are using fire. And it's actually quite simple. Fire is an incredibly effective tool at clearing land. And if you've got the option of paying $600 for a bulldozer, or 25 cents for a box of matches, communities who have access to no financial resources will always take the 25-cent option. And it's incredibly effective. Fire clears land very well, and unfortunately, it also is massively destructive once it gets beyond the areas that you were hoping to prepare. And that's where the damage occurred, was these unmanaged fires which were burning across the landscapes. And we're talking fires 1,000, 2,000, hectares burning across the landscape. Huge smoke haze impacting across the Malacca Straits into Singapore, shutting one of the busiest shipping straits in the world, smoke getting all the way up into Malaysia and Thailand. Huge impacts for local communities also on the ground. And so we invested $1 million in this program at year one. And what we said to communities, what would it take for you not to burn? And they said, it would just take, we would burn if you could help us to prepare the land. We said, we'll help you prepare land, but we will not do deforestation. It has to be land that's already been cleared and or is already agriculture, but is not in a good condition. So we actively helped communities do that, and we reduced burning by 90% in 2015, which is still one of the worst El Niños in Indonesia's history, one of the driest years in Indonesia's history. We reduced burning by 90%. And now we are continuing to expand this program. We've got over 900,000 hectares under voluntary MOUs with communities, memorandums of understanding with communities where they agree not to burn. And we pay them a small reward, and we continue to help them do their preparation, and we continue to help develop their capabilities. And I think over the last 10 years, we've spent something like $6 million. And we did an estimate the other day of what has been the impacts on the reduction of costs for the company, and it's over $80 million. So we're getting a much better result than we could have ever got by spending that money, that $6 million on firefighting equipment. And we're really proud to say actually now that that program was so successful that the Indonesian government has taken it and written it into regulation. So we're extremely proud of the work that we've done on Fire Free Village. In 2015, it wasn't nature finance. It was an absolute core priority to the business, and it was about cost reduction and damage reduction. So that's why I say that driver around risk is really a critical one if you want to engage with your stakeholders. Reducing your risk is a really critical way and a really helpful way of framing those discussions. If we can go to the next one, please. We have a really young shareholder, second generation shareholders for our company. We're a privately owned family company, in their 40s. And so are reasonably flexible in their thinking, are reasonably keen to adopt new ideas, and are always challenging us to break the mold and come up with something new. But this idea, full credit, has to go to our shareholder, who came to us one day and he said, I don't want the conservation teams to be wrestling for funding every year when I've got a 60-year commitment to conservation. Now, why do I have a 60-year commitment? Because that's how long our licenses last for. That's our license term is 60 years. And so he said, I don't want you guys having to wrestle with all the other operational budgets. I need to give you certainty because you aren't managing these landscapes on annual basis. You're managing it on long-term basis. And so he said, how do I guarantee you a stream of funding so you are not wrestling for budgets every year? And one of the fundamental principles he came up with was, I also want to be sure that we're spending the money that we make back in the areas where I've made that money. So if he's sourcing from particular areas, if there's a plantation in a particular area, then he wants to be sure that he's supporting the communities and the conservation outcomes in those sort of areas. And he called that his production. He produces from those areas. He's making profit from those areas, protection model or approach. And then he wants to spend that money back in those communities. And the way he did that was coming up with a very simple but very elegant solution for our conservation funding. And that was, he said, for every ton of wood that I produce and that crosses the weighbridge and enters the mill, I will charge myself $1, and that becomes my core for my conservation funding. Now, last year we delivered 15.5 million tonnes. So this year I have a budget of $15.5 million guaranteed for the conservation work that we're committed to. And that's an ongoing commitment from the shareholder. This is not a one-off. And sometimes you'll hear companies make big commitments, big allocations of funding, but you need to be clear about how long they're allocating that funding for. We're allocating this funding for 60 years. As long as wood fibre crosses the weighbridge, we will allocate funding to our conservation fund. And as the business grows, the benefit for the conservation team is that so does our budgets. And so I think that is just a really elegant solution for how to guarantee long-term sourcing funding, how to make sure that we can plan and do that with real security as we move forward. But also, how do we sort of recognize that, yeah, we're making money from these landscapes. Let's reinvest into nature and to communities that we work within these landscapes. And so I think one of the critical things that it also allowed us to do was to bring the nature funding into the core of our business thinking. And it shifted from being an expense to absolutely being seen as investment. And now we only consider this conservation fund as an investment fund, an investment in nature fund. And it was a really significant shift in thinking that occurred across our operations teams and across our finance teams and across the other services, that we shifted the thinking to say it's no longer something that's nice to do. It now sits at the very core of our annual decision-making processes, and it's an investment fund that we can all, access for nature, for nature programs. It's been an incredible innovation, and I think over the past, Charlie did some work. One of my colleagues did some work for me, and over the past sort of 5 or 6 years, we've spent $70 million on conservation. And as I said, this year I've got $15.5 million in my budget to spend on conservation programs. Next slide, please. We also work closely with communities, as I said before, and we work closely with communities on conservation because it's important that they move beyond just stopping burning and also work out how to be better stewards of the land themselves. And it's not to say they're bad stewards, it's often that they just don't know how to manage the land or how to often value nature within the landscapes in which they operate. At the moment, we've got partnerships with communities for about 30,000 hectares of land. It seems small when we talk about our nearly 500,000 hectares of conservation, but it's critically important landscapes because these are often the last remaining forests that these communities have around them. And so part of the discussion we have with communities is this is the heritage that you need, natural heritage that you need to hand over to your children. And this is the storytelling and the customary and traditional rights that you guys as a community need to hand over to your next generation. So we're very actively trying to help communities build their own capabilities on conservation management. And once again, this is about cost reduction for us. If I just want to look at it in the pure economic and business terms, it's about cost and risk reduction for us. But it's also a fantastic program to do, and I really enjoy working with communities on conservation, and we're really proud of the work that we do with communities. And it's fascinating watching communities, once you sort of guide them into the discussion and allow them to engage in a conversation about nature, how quickly communities become incredibly passionate about it, and they become really the motivators and the drivers of change themselves. Next slide, please. This is a bit more of a dry financial instrument. I don't have a cool photo to go with this one, I'm sorry. But sustainability-linked loans are increasingly becoming a core part of a lot of businesses' engagement. It requires, of course, independent verification by professional ESG auditors to ensure and set those principles of the loan. Banks buy into the loan based on those principles, and then potentially offer variable interest rates of a few basis points for meeting the specific sustainability criteria. I have to say, for us, when we started engaging with banks, and they asked for some principles or components for assessment for the loan, we offered 80 separate indices for banks to consider, and they came back to 3. And what we found is actually, and this is sort of 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm sure the discussion's moved on since then, but ultimately the expectations of the stakeholders around what they're measuring are not particularly sophisticated. And so if you're considering sustainability linked loans as part of your overall financial mechanisms for finance, the metrics that are being used are not particularly sophisticated. And that's largely a function of the fact that people don't understand nature particularly well, and they have to come back to some very basic principles. One of the key metrics for us is that we are spending our nature fund. That's one of the key 3 metrics that we offer to banks every year, is that we are allocating and spending effectively for impact on conservation the $15.5 million a year. And there's just an example of one of the others. I'm not allowed to disclose what they are because they're commercially in confidence with each of the loan providers, but the financial institutions are very active in seeking more information when they need to, based on these instruments. Currently, we have over $1 billion in financial instruments linked to sustainability-linked loans. So they do make up a significant proportion of our operational financing. Thank you. Next slide. Carbon, we spoke about it a little bit at the start. We use the large conservation area, which I showed in the photo at the front. This is another shot of that peatland swamp forest, beautiful area. 130,000 hectares is part of that. It's one of the world's largest carbon projects. Nearly 7 million tons of CO2 is validated. We haven't sold a single credit yet. The markets in Indonesia aren't ready for really big sales. We're hoping the regulations will be set up this year. We're not relying on it really. We continue to fund this work. Would love it to be self-funding, and ultimately we sort of see that as a loan for the carbon project until it can pay it back. We will recycle that funding. One of the commitments from the owner, of course, is to ensure that in that production protection model, if we're generating income from these carbon projects, that any profit from those projects is reinvested in local communities and conservation projects. Yeah, not much to say around carbon because we haven't sold a single carbon credit yet, but we hope to be doing that this year. Next, and we're coming towards the end of this discussion now. So what are the challenges? Often, I think the language is evolving quickly, as I said, but often investments from companies are not recognised as nature finance, and that's probably why that gap is so big. And if we get the language right, I hope that gap decreases just by the fact that more investments from companies are being recognised as nature, and maybe slight tweaks to how companies make investments can be then recognised as nature. And often nature-based solutions are not financial instruments, right? Or they can't be monetized. They might be difficult to quantify and even sometimes really difficult to measure. We spoke a little bit about the measurement of biodiversity. It's not easy. I think last time I checked, there's 660 variables you can measure in relation to biodiversity. There's not a single CO2 equivalent that you can use. There's not a biodiversity equivalent that you can use for biodiversity. So it's incredibly difficult to measure. Market integrity has been a real challenge. The recent expose from The Guardian, I think, was important. It wasn't helpful in terms of driving carbon markets. And so we've been very, very cautious in terms of how we want to frame our carbon projects and what they mean for us. They're a nice to have rather than a fundamental need to have. So we're approaching the whole market integrity issue very, very carefully, and in fact we're seeking a CCB. For those in the know, that's a very high standard for our carbon projects before we look to sell. And as I said earlier, some of these issues aren't easily monetized, and that's going to be difficult as we move forward to try and to understand this. And my last slide, I think, is just where we're going and where we're up to. As I said, we're going to continue to make significant investments in nature as our business grows. I know there's been some noise from some corporates around backpedaling on commitments. We have the support of the shareholder to maintain our commitments, and particularly to increase the focus on our nature-based commitments through the Thriving Nature strategy. We believe that they're an important part of our overall business. We consider them to be investments, and we're not stepping away from those. For the private sector, more broadly, I think the discussion has certainly shifted, and when I speak to colleagues and peers around the world, it's no longer whether we should be investing in nature, it's how quickly we can shift our own language, our own thinking, our own policies, and our own targets to integrate nature into strategy, into risk, into risk management, and also into longer term investment decisions. I hope that's been helpful, and I know there's a few comments and questions in the bottom. Hopefully they're all quite easy questions.
Thank you very much, Craig, for this very, very detailed and illuminating presentation. I think that people are very reacting. We have technically 6 minutes, but do you have 4 more minutes? Because there are essentially 8 questions. I think that if we can get at least 2 batches of 3, I will ask the first 3 people to state their questions quickly. Then I'll get back to you, and then we pick up.
Jorge, can I say that send the questions through and I will respond if we don't get to all the questions tonight, and and in your next course or in an email, I can respond to all the questions for sure. So please don't feel like if your question doesn't get asked tonight, it's ignored. I will absolutely take them on notice and respond for those who don't get their questions.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Craig. So Mianu, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Craig, for this very insightful presentation. I guess this is more of a little of an open question. You already partially answered it in your conclusion, but I was just curious as to how this, I think you mentioned it, how this new era of green shushing may have affected how April is communicating its sustainability commitments and reporting. And also, if I could just tack on an extra question to that, since I'm here, on the change that you've seen in the market and how the market itself is viewing certifications now. Just
Thanks,
those 2, sorry.
Lucia.
Thanks a lot, Craig, for your presentation. I am going to be quite concrete. Which are exactly the metrics that you are using to measure biodiversity gain, and which technologies are you using, as you have a huge surface to manage? Which are the technologies that you are using? Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. Anneke?
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. I actually have a question about the navigation of the business operations, because we know business is growing, and I expect that growing business also relies on really increasing plantations, but you also have a growth of being nature positive. So I'm very curious to how that links to the restoration work.
Good question.
Back to you, Craig.
Thank you. So thank you. The green shushing has been a really interesting discussion internally. One of my colleagues, Charlie, was going to try and join, but I think he's trying to shush his children to bed at the moment, unfortunately. So he won't be joining us. But it's been really interesting for us. We've been very, very cautious about how we discuss and present our work. And one of the fundamentals we've come back to is to not overplay what we do and to always come back to solid data and solid science. And if the science and the data aren't supporting our argument, then we need to rethink our argument. That's as simple as that. Our shareholder has a very strong mantra for us. It's always better done than said. He would rather do the work and just get it done than spend the time on the PR and the headlines. And this is why we rarely go, we spend more time in the scientific marketplace in terms of how we present our ideas than we do in the sort of in the more open marketplace of ideas. And so a lot of our science is published. And I think that's really gives us confidence that we can move forward because the data helps to support our arguments. In terms of certification, I really don't want to downplay certification. I didn't mean it to be that way. What I'm trying to say is I think it's going to change significantly and how much the market relies on it because there's so much other strong frameworks coming to the fore and regulatory requirements and stakeholder expectations that where it used to be only certification, that was the only thing you had to rely on. Now the marketplace is filling up very quickly. And my concern for people like, and I know we work very closely with PEFC, my fear is that they're going to fall behind and they're not going to be able to keep up. And that's okay because I think that's how these things evolve, right? The discussion will move on and it's going to move very quickly. I think this discussion is going to move very, very quickly over the next 2 or 3 years. We asked around how do we measure biodiversity gain? When that was a target, as an ecologist, I fell off my chair and laid in the fetal position for about 3 days trying to work out how do you measure biodiversity gain? It's impossible. And so we, at the very start, just used a very rude metric of hectares. But we are now starting to, and if you like, I can share our Thriving Nature document with you. We are now starting to move to much more stronger focus on some density-based measurements with some landscape species. It's impossible to measure everything in biodiversity. You can't measure every ant, every beetle, every bird, every grub, every dragonfly. You've got to make a selection, and we've used the landscape species process to pick out those species which are of the most, I need to be careful, most importance is an awful word, for the landscape, and there's a very strong science behind that created by WCS. It's published in scientific journals, it's peer reviewed. We've used those processes to now define 8 species, and they will become the core of our base for reporting. And that's not to say we don't continue to measure everything else. We just can't report everything at one time. So we're using a lot of tech. We're just experimenting with some AI cameras on the AI on the edge. The AI sits inside the camera. It can do the species identification or the bucketing at least within the camera, which saves an enormous amount of time. We've got something like 600 cameras out in the field at any one time. And that's by far that's the core part of our biodiversity assessment processes. And then we use a randomly stratified sample we can talk more about that, the stats behind it, but it's a statistically robust methodology. Navigation between business ops and increasing plantations, great question. And if I take you back to our April 2030 targets, one of the key targets was huge investments in increasing our productivity. Our business will only grow if we can make more from the same amount of area. We use forestry uses a measure called MAI, mean annual increment, and we've got a target set against how much wood we can grow per hectare every year. We've got a lot of room to improve when we look at global standards in Indonesia. And there's lots of ways of doing that through genetics, through better silvicultural practices, through better handling, and through better selection of trees to the right site. And so there's lots of mechanisms that we're pulling. We call it precision silviculture, and we've seen about a 30% increase over the past 3 years, and we need to continue that trend to ensure that our business can continue to grow at the same time as our investments in nature also continue to grow. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. If you have 3 more minutes, just 3.
I do.
Then we can actually ask Andrew, Emily, and Lyubov to answer questions in about 1 minute, the 3 of them. And then we have 2 minutes left. And the rest, the other 2 questions, Eddie and Alistair, can be written down and sent to Craig.
Yeah, no, please send them through. I will get to them, sure.
Andrew, please.
I will try to be brief. Thank you, Jorge, and thanks, Craig, for the really, really interesting presentation. There was a comment you made earlier about how the Task Force for Nature Disclosure has changed your approach, and particularly giving you a sort of common language internally, and I imagine also externally. So I wonder if you could unpack that a bit more. How has that changed the sort of things that you're investing in and your sort of communication around it? And also link that back to the 3 categories you had at the beginning, the transition, the risk-based, and the other category, just to help explain that. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Emily?
Thank you. That was really inspiring, Craig, hearing about all the great work that April are doing. My question was just on harmful nature subsidies and whether you've, in mapping all the work you're doing, if you mapped your supply chain dependency on these subsidies, and if so, how are you finding that and the data behind it?
Thanks, Emily. And Lyubov, please.
Thank you very much, Greg, for inspiring indeed the presentation. I would just want to better understand the role of nature finance in overall business model of the April Group, more specifically, which maybe share of the overall income or revenue the nature finance, your own investment, nature investment has, and also in terms of as the group, you're using the nature finance instrument, as you mentioned, the loans, for instance, green loans, which percentage of the overall finance, I mean, like instruments as a company you raise or you use through this nature finance instrument? Thank you.
Back to you, Craig.
Thank you. Andrew, I think there's a whole nother hour on your question. I think it's a really great question. Can I tell you that the first thing it did was it gave us confidence to and gave the whole sustainability team confidence to actually unpack finance now with a common language. So having documentation that was written by independent experts and shared broadly with the team was really powerful for the team to start realizing that actually this is a conversation we need to be having. So that's the very first thing I'd say there is. The second thing is it really opened the door to finance. And when I say it opened the door, they came to us, actually. That was the point that finance crossed the floor and said, I don't know what you guys in sustainability do, but we need your help because we've got this, right? And so I think that was the transition I was trying to allude to before. It wasn't driven by us anymore. It was now driven by other stakeholders in the business because they were getting questions from their own stakeholder environment. You know, banks and finances, investors and other people in the marketplace were starting to ask our own teams, including our commercial teams and our banking and finance teams, what does this mean? How does this work? What are you guys doing on this? And so that's where those conversations started internally. And it's a shame Charlie couldn't join us because his role is actually engaging directly with the banking, finance and commercial teams. And a lot of the discussions they have is through the lens of TNFD, to be honest, and dependencies and impacts, those sorts of discussions. Words that we wouldn't have used 3 years ago are now part of the common vernacular because those documents allowed us to have those discussions internally, but then also to have a common language as we explored those spaces externally. And it gave weight to what we were doing, and helped frame it in a much more effective way. But yeah, really, that's a great question. And if I've got more, I'll certainly throw some comments into a note. Harmful subsidies. Yeah, this is a killer, right? I mean, this far outweighs that gap. I think I don't know whether it's about 3 or 4 times harmful subsidies outweigh the gap in finance. We took a really clear view of this and if you unpack some of those 2030 obligations, you'll see that in there that we've said, and it's hidden a little bit in the text, but we were actually trying to drive to your very point, Emily, by saying if we can not pay for this, can we use that money for something else? Is sort of how we try to navigate that space. We didn't call it harmful subsidies. We didn't want to upset anybody. I'll give you one example. We've been over the past 3 or 4 years very actively moving our estate camps, which are all quite remote, out in the field, away from using diesel generators and onto battery solar combinations. And the payback period has gone from, I think it was originally about 6 years down to about 3 for solar. And so we're now, but what's really been useful is they never run out. Where the truck couldn't get through because it was flooded, or the truck broke down and there was no diesel, they didn't have power, right? That doesn't happen anymore. So we've not only reduced the harmful subsidies of literally paying for diesel just to burn diesel for no apparent reason, to now actually transitioning that money and the costs of the diesel to other programs within those camps. And so we've actually said, you're not paying for diesel, let's spend that money on something for you guys as a local community that we can help support. So it's been really an interesting discussion. We didn't take it head on. We were a bit sneaky. We tried just to embed it in the discussions. And the last one was, I've got to be a bit careful here. We're a private company. We don't disclose our revenues. But I can say that the $15 million it certainly appears on the books. It's single digit proportion of our overall revenues, but it certainly comes to the attention when we're doing all of our budget and business planning. For our SLLs, I'm convinced it's about 100% of our current financial mechanisms are all sustainability linked loans. We went to the market last year with a roadshow, and that was the core of our discussions with all the financial institutions that these loans would be SLLs. And so if they're not, some of the historical ones may not fully be, but all the current and future tranches of finance will be SLLs moving forward. Yes, I can say that with certainty. Thank you, Jorge.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Craig. Thank you very much to all the participants for the questions. I know that Eddie and Alistair had questions, and I would perhaps ask them to send them to Rose, and so Rose can circulate them to Craig.
Absolutely.
In due course. Yep. So thank you very much again, Craig, for being with us and sharing your insights. We'll take now a break of essentially, let's put 8 minutes, and we will be back then.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks again. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.